Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. One of the things that causes us the most difficulties, gets us into the most trouble, and causes the most suffering is our own mind and the mental states that arise in the mind. Ultimately, according to the Buddha, everything originates in the mind. The mind is the forerunner, the mind is the chief. But leaving aside this metaphysical aspect, it's fascinating and interesting, is topic for another day perhaps. Just on the practical level, what we are dealing with in our lives and our situations, the ups and downs, the difficulties and triumphs, and all our interpersonal relations, ultimately rests on our mind states. And I'd like to really emphasize two important points or aspects for dealing with the changing state of our minds. The first is not to take our mental states so seriously, not to validate them or reify them or regard them as ultimately important. If we can see the mental states just as they are in their own nature, and if we understand their nature, they're conditionally arisen, they're impermanent, they're not an expression of reality, and they're ultimately empty. It can be hard to see things in that way when you're caught in the middle of some turmoil. But that's when it becomes critically important that we don't succumb to being manipulated or pulled around by passing mental states. Our mental reactions might be anything from triumphant feelings of happiness to depressive states, anger or elation, confusion, anxiety. And these various states might have a reference point to the external universe. That only means that they're conditional. They arise according to causes and conditions. It doesn't make them real or ultimately valid. It's a principle of Abhidhamma that nothing arises without a cause and nothing arises from a single cause. And that second part is important. When we have a mental reaction to other people or external events, or even to a purely mental object like a memory, it has multiple causes. There's an external trigger itself, but there's also the whole karmic history and the conditioning that you're taking into that moment. No moment is an isolated event. Everything has a multi-layered history and precedents and conditioning and character that has been shaped by karma and life experience. And you're taking all this complex network of causation into the present moment and experiencing a mental state. So the mental state in itself is not a substantial thing. It's not an entity. It doesn't have any ultimate validity. So the first mistake to avoid is not to assume that it's true or real. It's a product of causes and conditions. And it's to see it as impermanent, transient. It changes. We know that our emotional states can be up and down like a roller coaster. Part of this is a reaction to the 8 worldly Damas, which the Buddha cautioned against. In Tibetan, they're also called the 8 worldly winds. When Milarepa found Rachungpa all downcast and looking miserable and hangdog sitting in his meditation cave, he said, "What's the matter, Rachungpa? Are the 8 worldly winds howling through your cave?" No? 8 worldly winds or worldly dhammas are praise and blame, gain and loss, pleasure and pain, fame and disrepute. Praise and blame are an obvious pair to watch the mental reaction. If someone praises you, "Oh, you've done a good job, you're such a nice person," you feel all happy and elated, and an hour later somebody else criticizes you, "Oh, you're so sloppy, I can't take this racket that you're making," or whatever, and you feel all downcast and miserable. And in both cases, you're allowing yourself to be swayed by the worldly dhammas, which are impermanent, unreliable, constantly changing. And if we put our dependence on the worldly dhammas, if we seek happiness in the worldly dhammas, we're endlessly going to be on this roller coaster ride of ups and downs. But if we just take things in stride as a momentary event, not ultimately lasting, not ultimately real, conditionally arisen, and any reaction to it is to be taken the same way. This is not substantially real. This is not ultimately valid or important in any way. It's empty. It's void of substance. Then we're free. And our inner well-being, our inner peace and happiness is not dependent on external conditions. And it's important to see them as empty and without a reference point of self. With these dhammas, praise and blame, pleasure and pain, gain and loss, fame and disrepute, they only have a hook or a effect when there's a self-reference point, when there's a me or mine to be either aggrandized or thrown down. Then they gain an illusory importance. But if we see things in terms of ultimate voidness, the emptiness of self and world, then there's no place, there's no ground for the hook to sink in. This is just phenomena arising and passing away. And we can find then our mental state can be very clear and bright and unburdened, light and free, if we abandon this constant reference to me and mine, to self and what pertains to self. to see the external world as empty as well, a product of causes and conditions, impermanent, passing, ultimately unsatisfying, never perfect. You know? It's samsara, it's supposed to be broken. It can help to lighten this burdensome identification with mental states, to develop some kind of sense of humor about it, to see, if you see yourself falling into mental patterns of old habit forms that are negative or destructive, to regard it in a way as, oh, it's just that silly nonsense again. You know? To dismiss it in that way as being, too absurd to be taken seriously. I remember one of Kema Ananda's sayings was that the universe is a big joke, and someone objected to that and says, "Well, I don't find it very funny." And he says, "That's only because you haven't got to the punchline." Uh, the truth is, we are, all of us, until we become arahants, we're all silly, ridiculous creatures, and we shouldn't take ourselves too seriously, and take our states of mind, our emotional states, our feelings, our fears. Don't take them seriously. It's just empty, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes pompous notions passing through the mind without any substance to them. And how can that which has no substance cause you any harm? So that's one point I wanted to make, is not taking your mental states as serious or substantial or important, seeing them in the correct way as being impermanent, insubstantial, independently arisen. The other point is to remember that ultimately you are responsible for your own mind, and not the external world, not circumstances, and not other people. This is maybe something that is very useful to remember this time of year, when you may be traveling about or seeing old friends and family and getting into maybe sometimes personally difficult situations. To remember you are responsible for your own mental states. Your reaction to things is entirely your own responsibility, and it's very weak sort of excuse to say, well, I can't help it. She always makes me so angry, or he really pushes my triggers. This is completely bogus. Other people are responsible for their own states, and they may sometimes act in unskillful ways. They may sometimes be hurtful, but that's on them. But your reaction to it, your internal processing of that, is entirely on you. You have to watch your own mind states, guard your sense doors, guard your mind states. Try and avoid being manipulated by causes and conditions into unskillful states of mind. Unskillful states like anger, or like fear, or confusion. Simply registering causes and conditions in the mind, registering the situation with equanimity and wisdom and dealing with it. You always have a choice. You always have an option whether to go with reactive emotional states or not. So these two things together, not believing, not validating, not taking seriously the passing weather conditions of the mind, and secondly, taking responsibility for your own mental states and reactions and not making excuses by externalizing the imagining yourself to be helpless in terms of external stimulus. If you remember these 2 points, then you've gone a long way towards stabilizing and easing the conditions of the mind. Remember not to be too hard on yourself until you have reached the stage of arahantship. You will have unskillful states of mind arise from time to time. Uh, that's just human failing, human nature. There's no avoiding that until the point of arahantship or perfection. But it's how you deal with them, how you react to them, what you make of them. That's the real test, and it's a test of your Dhamma practice. Not so much how contained you are when you're sitting on the cushion, but how you're able to deal with unexpected causes and conditions coming from the outside when you're in the middle of the life and dealing with situations and persons. Are you able to keep centered, keep it together, know the conditions of the mind, see them as empty, abandon thoughts of self, and not be a dependent slave to the 8 worldly Damas? The quality of equanimity, upekkha, is very important, very helpful in all situations. If you can find the ability to center yourself in this non-reactive, calm center, and let everything else happen on the periphery, but you're centered in a place of calmness and clarity and clear seeing. Then you're going to be able to deal with any situation. If you allow yourself to be caught by extreme mental states and reactions and identify with them, then you're in serious trouble. You're then coming into being, creating a self around a false nucleus of some extreme state. Sometimes a simple cognitive trick can help. If you find yourself getting caught up in some extreme emotion like anger, don't think, I am angry, but think, anger has arisen, or here is anger. Don't personalize it. See it as a process external to the knowing. And same with anxiety or anything else. People say, I am an angry person, or I am an anxious person, or whatever. This is a very harmful way of thinking. You're kind of solidifying and taking ownership then of those states It's better to, acknowledge if you're having trouble with anger, acknowledge it. Don't try and pretend it's not there, but recognize it as anger frequently arises lately, rather than I am angry. It's not really true. It's not metaphysically true to say anybody is an angry person or an anxious person or a loving person or anything else. It's just to say that these states frequently arise in this continuum. And also finally to frequently reiterate the point, comes up pretty much in every one of these talks, that reiterate the point that the best Gallatin key, the best medicine for sorting all this stuff out is to see the emptiness of it. You see the non-self nature, the void nature of both the knowing mind and the objects of the knowing mind, which include the mental states and the external universe, to see them all as empty void without inherent self-substance, not existing from their own side, without intrinsic essence. If you can find a way to see things in that manner, then that liberates you tremendously, and it frees up, releases a lot of burdens. And in particular, reference to what the theme of today's talk, to see the mental states, the thoughts and emotions, memories, to see all these things as empty and without substance.